So hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Salvador Munoz, and I am the Public Programs Manager at Poster House, the first and only museum in the United States dedicated to the art and history of the poster. And tonight it is my immense pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Real Hot Girl Representations of Black Womanhood in Blaxploitation and Beyond. And this program is presented in conjunction with Poster House's current exhibition, You Won't Bleed Me, How Blaxploitation Posters Defined Cool and Delivered Profits, on view at Poster House through February 6th. In this expansive conversation, Dr. Robin Boylorn will examine portrayals of Black women from the height of the Blaxploitation era and compare these with contemporary representations of Black women in hip hop and popular culture. Dr. Robin Boylorn is an accomplished scholar, activist, writer, speaker, and thinker. Her work concentrates on ways of documenting marginalized lives and making them accessible and available to wider audiences. And she is a member of the Crunk Feminist Collective, whose latest book, Feminist AF, is available now wherever books are sold. And I'm going to go ahead and drop a link into the chat for those of you who are interested. So before we get started, I just wanted to share a few notes on accessibility for this event. Automated closed captioning is available for those who need it, and you can turn it on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And this program will be recorded and made available for all registered attendees after the event. Lastly, attendees will have the opportunity to ask our guests questions at the end of the program, and you can drop those in either the chat or the Q&A box at any time, and I'll go ahead and vocalize them during the Q&A session at the end. Okay, so that's it for me, and now I'm going to hand it over to Robin to go ahead and go on with the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and I want to thank everybody that is participating tonight, and those that will be watching this in the future. I really appreciate your participation and interest in this topic. I was really excited at the opportunity to kind of engage Blaxploitation from a different perspective than I ever have before. So I first want to thank Salvador and his colleagues at Poster House for inviting me to participate in this program that is inspired by the You Won't Bleed Me, How Blaxploitation Posters Defined Cool and Delivered Profits exhibit. And like I was saying, it's an opportunity to engage in a conversation that I do hope you'll participate in through Q&A, to understand and deconstruct representations and characterizations of Black women over time and in the public imagination, but particularly through the male gaze and through the genre of Blaxploitation film through hip hop from then to now. So, admittedly, in the past, I've mostly and only thought about the representation of Black women in Blaxploitation films through a lens of critique. But one of the things that the exhibit challenged me to do was to rethink and reimagine the experience and representation of Black women beyond the limited scope of Blaxploitation. It made me think, what was erased or stolen from Black women in those films and in those representations? Both the actors and the characters they portrayed were limited in scope to stereotypes because they were being written and directed primarily by white and Black men. So what happens, for example, if we reimagine and reclaim Black women's agency in their portrayal of these women and these characters and characterizations in their embodiment of themselves? What happens when we celebrate Black women's bodies and sexuality? What happens when we reframe the narratives in ways that can empower Black women? Now, I am going to say, I do have a caveat that I don't know that what I am suggesting is or should be applicable in all cases, right? So for example, there is a scene in the film Foxy Brown where she is gang raped. And her response to that, after being not just sexualized, but violated, is stoicism. And to me, that stereotype, the stereotype of the strong Black woman, right? And the Jezebel, the hypersexualized Black woman, allowed the writer and the director to shape Black women as insatiable, unrapeable, and incapable of feeling pain. And to me, that is beyond the scope of this, right? Because that kind of dehumanization of Black women is problematic, not only because of a history of sexual assault Black women have suffered at the hands of white men, but also because it bastardizes her sexuality, rendering it a point of shame or highlighting it as the preface to her demise. So the ability of some of the characters to compartmentalize themselves from their bodies will always be a trope of the white imagination. It will always be a lie to say that Black women can be touched, fondled, molested, or raped with no consequence, emotionally or physically. No one is that strong. And while I am willing to reimagine the sexual agency of Black women in Blaxploitation, I cannot relinquish my inability and refusal to affirm or justify the storylines of sexual assault that rendered them powerless and numb. I am, however, willing to think about how the imagery and intentionality of hypersexuality that the women embodied themselves, separate from the storylines, can be contextualized in ways that reflect a rejection of the former asexualized Black mammy, and that introduces the confidence and possibilities of the current moment. This new framing calls for a reconsideration of Blaxploitation films, not as the downfall of Black women's representation, but the downfall of Black women or the start of a negativity around Black women's sexual liberation, but rather as the beginning of it and the beginning of a good thing. You're going to reframe it as a good thing. So Black feminism of the 21st century invites us to think about our experiences, not just intersectionality or not just intersectionally and intergenerationally, but inclusively. In her book, Hood Feminism, Mikki Kendall argues that the movement fails when it doesn't account for and consider the experiences of women who are not considered quote unquote good girls and make room for them. She says that if everyone is not included, then the feminism isn't big enough. So while ratchetness is generally framed negatively, some scholars argue that ratchetness offers Black women an opportunity for resistance. For example, Brittany Cooper argues that ratchetness can be seen as a dismissal of respectability, what she calls disrespectability politics. According to Cooper, disrespectability politics are an act of transgression that Black women can use to push back against rigid expectations of acceptable womanhood. This disrespectability politics, which plays off of the terms disrespect and respectability politics, urges Black women to have more agency in their race and gender performances while offering a gender and race critique of whitewashed identity politics. This stance is particularly relevant when thinking about representations of Black women because of the harsh critiques Black women receive for not living up to conservative and upper class Black elitist expectations for femininity. Similarly, Heidi Renee Lewis resists the assumption that respectability and ratchetness are incompatible categories. So Lewis believes respectability and ratchetness are compatible and capable of coexisting in the same woman at the same time. Brittany Cooper asks or states in a Crunk Feminist Collective blog in 2012, we must ask what ratchetness itself makes possible, even as the gratuitous and exploitative display of it attempts to foreclose possibility. What does ratchetness do for the ratchet and non-ratchet and sometimes ratchet alike? In impartial response to those questions, I coined the term ratchet respectability to help explain what I see as an allowance for Black women to coalesce ratchet behavior that's often linked to race and class, and politics of respectability that's often linked to race and gender, claiming that you can be both ratchet and respectable at the same time. To me, some performances of being a hot girl embody ratchet respectability, both retrospectively in Blaxploitation films and contemporarily in hip hop. Black exploitation films translated to the exploitation of Black women in similar ways that hip hop. And hip hop has historically embraced and heralded the cool masculinity reflected in Blaxploitation films. So there is an inevitable relationship between the two. Now, some of these are 2021 questions. but they date back to the 1970s. Blaxploitation films emerged as a subgenre of independent, low-budget films with primarily Black cast in the 1970s, with the aim of targeting Black audiences. Now, the films relied heavily on stereotypes of the Black community and fantasies of Black womanhood because some of the more popular films were written and directed by white men. And while the films would inevitably attract Black audiences because it finally included Black actors as leads, they were mostly successful, these Blaxploitation films, because of the crossover appeal, the white people's curiosities about Black life and Black women. So it was the mixed audience that makes Blaxploitation films particularly problematic as representative, right? Because while Black folk will recognize a stereotype in a film as sometimes but not always representative, white folk whose interactions with Black people were limited would not make that distinction. So the representations would be used then to further criminalize and demonize Black people in real life. It's also important to note that films become histories. They mark moments in time and narratives of experience. So the experiences in those films, they were very violent and sexual and exaggerated. And that in many ways limited the liberation possibilities that it could have otherwise offered. In an article called Black Women and Liberation in Blaxploitation Films, Louis Tambu argues that the liberation of Black women in these films were not really for Black women, right? He states, considering the fact that both Foxy Brown and Coffee were written, produced, and directed entirely by Black and white men, it is important to question who these images of liberated women were truly for and what it says about the depiction of what liberated Black women were expected to look like on film. Ultimately, looking at certain scenes in films like Foxy Brown and Coffee, it is unclear, or it is clear, that many aspects of the movie producers' ideals of what a Black liberated woman looked like were rooted in their fantasies of what they wanted her to look like. And what did they want her to look like? We see some of these images here from both then and now, kind of tracing the 1970s through the 2020s. And we see Black women who are sexy and seemingly empowered by that sexuality. But there is a difference between women who, what I want you to think about is there a difference between some of the images from films that show us the liberated Black woman, and then some of the images of 2020s hip hop MCs and how and whether or not they are depicting liberated Black women. So Aisha Staggers suggests that the three types of women represented in Blaxploitation films were the three H's. She called them heroines, honeys, and hoes. And I'm going to go back because I kind of got to it too soon before. So sometimes she said that the heroine, honey, and hoe appeared as individual characters, and other times one woman embodied all three of them at the same time. So the heroine, self-explanatory, she has strength, resolve, and badassness. She resembles Black women of the Black Panther Party, but the passive gentility of the civil rights movement is also found in this same, housed in this same body. So in other words, she did whatever she needed to do to please her man, to protect her man, and to avenge her man if needed. But she also believed in patriarchy, so she shrank all of that, you know, in the presence of her man. And then we have the honey, and the honey is like a version of a mulatto, right? It would be the light-skinned Black woman. Honeys, unlike heroines, were supporting actresses, usually the girlfriend of the leading man in the film. So not explicitly or necessarily sexualized. These women were accessories, but almost always had a particular aesthetic. And then the hoe. The hoe was willing to use sex to get whatever they want, including revenge. We see that characterization played out in many of the Blaxploitation films that feature, for example, Pam Grier. Now, those three stereotypes, the H's, align with more traditional ones. Now, Dion Stevens and Laylee Phillips have an article called Freaks, Gold Diggers, Divas, and Dykes, the Socio-Historical Development of Adolescent African-American Women's Sexual Scripts. And they identify multiple scripts of Black womanhood that are foundational. And this is also something that's understood in the context of Black feminism. And so these foundational scripts include the mammy, the matriarch, the Jezebel, and the welfare mother. And many times we see how with those particular representations, Black women are either asexualized or hypersexualized, not really found in the middle. The mammy and the matriarch, of course, are asexualized versions of the Black woman. The Jezebel and the welfare mother are seen as more promiscuous scripts or iterations of that. So we have these foundational scripts that reappear in different ways and in different contexts and in different representations. So even though we say, oh, well, it's 2021, we're beyond that, we're beyond Sapphire and Jezebel, and we are, but then the tropes that then replace those become similarly connected, right, to those foundational tropes. So the more updated versions that were influenced by hip hop included the gold digger, the diva, the gangsta bitch, and the freak. And so you can see here the ways in which those particular ones, and I also included Jezebel there, are explicitly have explicit sexual connections to who they are, right? So they are hyper femme and hypersexualized at the same time. So while some of the terms have changed, and even from then until now, some of these terms may be different, but they're always recognizable and applicable when we think about the tropes and representations of Black women that we see. So interestingly, like Blaxploitation, hip hop representations of Black womanhood have always been remarkably masculine, right? Part of the masculinization is the suggestion of violence and the suggestion of hypersexuality and the cool factor, which definitely reflected in the 80s and 90s, but most particularly in the 90s. 20 years past Blaxploitation, hip hop resurged some of those images and soundtracks for a newer generation. And so we had rappers adopting names and aliases that were consistent with Blaxploitation films, and iconography in music videos and samples and songs would always give a nod to the badass Black women of the Blaxploitation era, right? So, and for those of you like me, I was coming of age in the 90s, so Foxy Brown and Little Kim, though they were the soundtrack of my teenage life, and very much introducing me in the ways I imagine Pam Grier and would have introduced my mother to these possibilities of sexuality as I was coming of age. But the problem is that even both in Blaxploitation and in hip hop and in popular culture writ large, we see a binary of Black womanhood promoted here. So, in the same way that Blaxploitation films kind of situated Black women in a particular way, so too hip hop. And hip hop situated Black women as good girls and bad girls, right? We've heard this, the good girl, which is the one that you kind of put in your pocket and come back for later, and the bad girl that you can have your fun with now. And because it was, unironic that bad girls were those that were desired and conquered sexually, and good girls were those that were desired for long-term later relationship. And then we think about the early hip hop. And so early hip hop found women performing cool masculinity, excluding their femininity altogether. And I'm thinking here of, you think like Queen Latifah, right? Moni Love. These female MCs were not showing skin, right? So they were very much hypermasculinized instead of being hypersexualized. But then, so the only time we really saw sex in that context particularly in the 90s, was through video vixens, where the women who were in the music videos, and they were able to embody sexuality in a way that the Black woman rappers were not, mimicking the lyrics of men. So video vixens were often obscured and faceless, coconut colored curves and body parts parading around men in music videos, often without recognition, oftentimes faceless, oftentimes without any perceived dignity. But then enter Lil' Kim, enter Foxy Brown, enter Eve, right? So you have these femme women surrounded by an entourage of all men in hip hop crews. And they began to embody the empowerment of the women of Blaxploitation by embracing and flaunting their sexuality alongside their bravado and fearlessness. So they were scantily clad and foul-mouthed, right? They were ratchet. They were the bad bitches of the 20th century, insisting on visibility on their own terms. They flipped the script and the male gaze by reminding us that sexuality is not bad, right? Their embodiment of Cooper's disrespectability politics shifted the culture of hip hop and empowered other young Black women, myself included, to take ownership of their sexuality and pride in their bodies. But this is not without complication, right? Because it's not easy to ignore the guilt of being sexual when you have been socialized thinking that it's bad or even dangerous. And because in some cases it can be dangerous. Because of these stereotypes often ascribed to the bodies of Black women and girls, and because of the ways that Black girls are often adultified and hypersexualized from a young age, these stereotypes and these representations can sometimes be problematic, and they can create unsafety because of films like the Blaxploitation films that kind of depict Black women as unworthy of respect and care. Enter ratchet respectability, hip hop, Black women refusing to be shamed and embracing their femininity and sexuality on their own terms, not for the tempestuous gaze of men or white male fantasy, but for herself and for her own empowerment and for her own enjoyment, right? So, because essentially there's absolutely nothing wrong with being sexy, feeling sexy, dressing sexy, and or being sexual. And this includes heterosexual and non-heterosexual women, trans and cis women, and even those who were figuring out what all of this meant based on what they were seeing on a television screen, and how some of these young women are, learning what this means through Blaxploitation films that were created before they were even born. So let's think about how the exhibit then challenges us to look beyond the trope and stereotype of Blaxploitation films and beyond the trope and stereotype of Black women as hypersexualized. And what does that give us, right? And so I have this, collection of images, posters and pictures, as a way of kind of thinking about and looking at, these representations and how similar they are, right? And what do they have in common with each other across genres and years, right? So when we look at some of these images, they don't seem as distinct and disparate as we might think. And so when I think about the genealogy, right, of the hot girl, and like I said, hot girl also attaches itself as an emerging trope of Black womanhood, right? The hot girl. And Meg Thee Stallion popularized and I think copyrighted, right, that term a couple of years ago. And so she offers us a way of thinking about it, a definition about what being a hot girl is. And you would think that because of the imagery and the storylines that seemingly follow the hot girl, that she would be saying something about sex, and she's not, right? So she defines being a hot girl as just being yourself, right? And so when I think about what that means, and then we kind of put that in conversation with the fact that we were saying that there is nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong with sexuality, and being sexual is it's human, it's you being you. That's being a hot girl. So in other words, you don't have to be super femme to be a hot girl. You don't have to be voluptuous like Meg Thee Stallion or have her knees to be a hot girl. You don't have to be of legal age to be a hot girl. You don't have to be sexually active to be a hot girl. But it's like, you just be yourself, love yourself, right? And do so unapologetically. And I think that that's a really powerful message. And I think about how that then can then apply to Blaxploitation and the representations of Black women then. What if that was the lesson, right? What if that was what they were, if that was what they were offering to us? Because the other thing I think is really important to think about is how Black women, then and now, because we can say how great it is, this, they're so empowered and this is so wonderful, look at this feminism as being more expansive, but it's not without backlash. So back in the day, the Black women who were in these Blaxploitation films, many of which were considered to be almost like soft pornography, right? Because of because we're also thinking about white male fantasy of Black womanhood, right? And that kind of explains why, 2 minutes into a film, you have a naked Black woman, right? And it's like, okay, what does that have to do? Or in the middle of the film, breasts just fall out, or women are fighting half naked, you know what I'm saying? Like, so it's very much like, what are we doing here? And so Black women, and Pam Grier in particular, because she was one of the most well-known Blaxploitation actresses, was blamed for that. She was being blamed for the negative representation of Black women. And so this is not an everything is cyclical, because we hear this all the time. There's always someone wanting to put blame. They want to blame, for example, if we go from here, Meg Thee Stallion and Cardi B, if their children are listening to or watching a WAP video, right? It's because it's their responsibility to, police what your children are watching, right? So there's a way in which we kind of project blame onto Black women and want them to take responsibility, even for our consumption of their bodies. And so the thing that's really interesting, and that you always have to put in context, is what kind of power and agency did Pam Grier have? We see a character that she's playing. She's an actor. So she's taking a job. There were not many jobs for Black women. So we can say you should have just refused to play the character. But then how is she going to pay her bills, or, take care of herself? So we can't blame her. The problem isn't that she played this character. The problem is, and again, these things are very circular because I'm thinking about how present this is even now. The problem is that there wasn't a Black woman writing this character and creating the nuances of the character. There wasn't a Black woman director, there wasn't a Black woman in a position to make those decisions. All she could do was play the part and then try to make it as much herself as she could, and find ways of humanizing the character in the best ways that she could. But it's Blaxploitation, it's a low budget film, so it's not like it's high art. But I think that it was really irresponsible and unfair to put that responsibility on her, blaming her for taking a job. And we've seen this more recently, like from Viola Davis, and how she was also she got similar flack for playing a maid, right? So we have, why did you play this hypersexualized Black woman? You're making Black women look bad. And then Viola, why are you playing this asexual maid Black woman? You're making Black women look bad. And meanwhile, they're just trying to work, right? Because that Viola was pre, how to get away with murder Viola, right? She won't make it, And Foxy Brown was not, before she was Foxy Brown, she was not Foxy Brown, right? She was Pam Grier and playing in these low budget films. So she was just trying to build a career. And so is it fair to put the responsibility on individual Black women for the dearth of representation that exists, or for the irresponsible representations that they're acting, but they're not writing, right? So I think part of what this suggests is that we need more Black women artists and creatives that are in positions that can make these kind of decisions and make more nuanced characters, not a Black woman that is asexualized, right? But a Black woman who is both sexual and, right? Sexual and smart, and, because there are multiple ways of doing that. And so I would just be like, I want to see the scripts that were never made into movies that Black women wrote. Like that's kind of what I'm curious about in terms of what we didn't get to see. But so we think about Meg Thee Stallion, her telling us that a hot girl is whoever you are, which is a very empowering stance, right? It's a way to affirm other women. Like you might not do it like me. You might not be ratchet like me. You might not, twerk like me. You might not get down like me. You may not dress like me. You still a hot girl, right? And we think about how she has also translated that to, because she's going to be graduating college soon, and it was like college girl, what was it, hot girl fall or something last year when she was, it was like hot girl summer, and then it was like hot girl back to school. So kind of thinking about how she's positioning herself to be representative, not necessarily as, as the physical embodiment that everybody can lead up to, but just the confidence. She's trying to teach Black women to be confident. Whoever you are, however you are, be that and be bad at it, be the baddest, right? So as our modern day badass, she's trailblazing ways Black women can reclaim their sexuality, but also just themselves unapologetically. And she allows us to reimagine the hypersex Black women from hypersex Black woman, which is often problematic. And she asks us to reimagine her as empowered. What would it mean if I'm doing this because I want to? And it also makes me think of the City Girls and Cardi had the twerk song. I can't think of the name of it right now. It might have been called that. I can't remember. But they had the twerking video. All of these girls, right? The twerking contest. That was the flued out video, right? And all of these beautiful Black women twerking, having a twerking contest. There was not a man on the set, right? And to me, that was like the full representation of what this means. Like this is not about the male gaze. This is not about doing something for a man. It's just about being ourselves and being comfortable in our bodies and with each other, right? And not to say that the presence of a man is what makes something sexualized, because women can be turned on by each other. But it wasn't about that. It wasn't, it's almost kind of saying, why does, just because I'm twerking and I'm having fun, why is that automatically sexualized when I'm not intending it necessarily in a sexual way? And so that was another kind of example for me of how Meg Thee Stallion kind of is really turning the stereotype on its head. And if the hot girl, as defined by Meg Thee Stallion, is our new stereotype and trope for Black womanhood, I'm actually here for that one. So Blaxploitation films offer Black women the opportunity to be heroines of their own stories, right? Avengers and tricksters, instead of being reduced to mammies and sapphires or matriarchs. And I have argued that Black women have reclaimed their representations and their bodies, collapsing the stereotypes that have been used against them to foster an empowered and resilient, unapologetically sexual self that is an amalgamation of all previous representations used against them, right? In many ways, they have embraced the Blaxploitation Black woman, right? Because we can see from these images that they haven't resisted. They've gone all in. They're like, you were at 8, I'm gonna take it to 10, right? And I think that what makes it powerful is that it's not through the imagination and fantasy of whiteness or men, but through the ways in which they see themselves and other Black women, right? So that's an opportunity to shift towards new narratives and new possibilities as it relates to how we understand our bodies, but that too, right, is very nuanced and it's not without complications, because we think about the ways in which this new awareness and hyper awareness of bodies, and we think about, you know, the impacts and effects of social media, right? So this shift toward positive sexuality and body positivity also invites dysphoria, right? Because if we're seeing these images and this is what sexy or hot girl or whatever looks like, and I don't look like that, then what, right? Because I think that the existence of social media and this focus on sexy bodies as voluptuous bodies has led to, of course, an increase in insecurity, an increase in plastic surgery, and a decrease in self-esteem, right? So in some ways, it's having a counter effect. And so we, you know, and one of the images that I should have included here that I didn't, and I'm regretting that now, is Lizzo, right? Because Lizzo definitely embodies this same hot girl personification, but in a different body, type. And she is constantly shamed for it, but it is all the same, right? And so kind of thinking about this evolution from the 70s to 2021 and having more representative bodies that can be hot, right? So the conundrum is that embracing agency and authorship of sexuality in a moment of hypervisibility and image dissemination is really complicated, right? Because of Instagram and the ways in which we'll compare ourselves to each other. And so I think that I'm thinking about what we need. The problem then, as now, is always a dearth of representation that fails to account for Black women in all of their idiosyncrasies. So we need plural representations of hot girls and plural representations of bodies, of able bodies, of disabled bodies, of dark skinned, of light skinned, of thin, of not thin, right? So so that we can have a better representation of the nuances of Black womanhood, because we are not, nor have we ever been, monolithic. Unfortunately, the roles offered in these films didn't reflect that. Women were either mammies, matriarchs, sapphires, or Jezebels. But those images have been remixed and recalibrated. And even though they still exist in some form, Black women are resisting being seen only through those stereotypes. So as I kind of move to the second part of this conversation, where I want to reflect on what some of these things might mean in our future interactions with Black representations of Black women and future engagements and iterations of our own, is thinking about how reimagining Black woman stereotypes and Black women's sexuality, moving the agency and authorship from men to women, and from white men in particular to Black women in particular, how that can become a more powerful storyline. So some questions that I want to kind of reflect on through the Q&A and final thoughts at the end of Q&A is, what do the images that I've shared and some of the other images from the exhibit imply about Black womanhood? What do they mean? And what are your thoughts on the reclamation of stereotypes? What are your thoughts on the reclamation of hot girl? as a hot girl as our contemporary Jezebel, right? And have your thoughts about how Blaxploitation films represented Black women changed. Is there room and space for us to imagine a context in which Black women can be hypersexualized and empowered at the same time? So Salvador, I would love to move to some questions if we have them.
Yeah, Robin, first, before we jump into some of these questions, I just want to thank you so much for such an engaging and thought-provoking presentation. I think that the way that you handled this complex topic with delicate sensibility for everybody involved, I think is really beautiful. And I'm excited to dive into the conversation portion with you.
Thank you, me too.
Yeah. So the first question we have from the audience, and again, if you have any questions that come up that you'd like to share, please feel free to drop them in either the chat or the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to vocalize them on your behalf. So the first is, what about the idea that these quote unquote Blaxploitative images and characters paved the way for today's empowered, educated women images and characters? So much like the maid or the mammy sort of paved the way for a more well-rounded, fleshed out Black female characters we see today.
Mm-hmm. So can you repeat the first part of it? Is it asking I think to elaborate on it, or?
Yeah, does that feel like a fair representation, lineage to tease?
Absolutely. Right. Yes, absolutely. I would say that that's part of the argument I was trying to make in the talk, right? Is that it's actually legacy building and creating an opportunity for Black women to be more fully fleshed out sexual beings because of them and because of those representations. Now, I think that I do think that we have to be, because I'm a cultural critic at heart, right? So it's all, I think that we want to be cautious of not being critical, of only thinking about the positives and not negatives. And that's why I tried to introduce some of that in the talk as well, that yes, they have these representations. We have Black women that if we reimagine it from how we've been kind of socialized to think about it, they took what they had and created these characters that are timeless, right? That we're still talking about all this time later, that people are still trying to emulate. And because these, the movies are not great, the quality, they're not great, but the characters are so memorable, right? And the acting wasn't that great, right? So you have to think about what has made it so timeless. And so I think that is important. And I think that is to be reverenced, right? And recognized. But I think it's also important from both of those binaries, both from we have this representation of this woman that made these other representations possible, but kind of also thinking about what the sacrifices, and the consequences that these women suffered because of it, right? And that women are still suffering, because what I don't mean to imply in this talk is that we have evolved to a point to where, Black women who embody femininity and sexuality are considered respectable, right? I'm making the argument that they are, but that they don't have to be, right? And they don't have to be respectable, right? They can be hypersexual, they can be fast, whatever you want to call it, and that's okay too. You know what I'm saying? All of those things are okay, but I definitely think that those representations, problematic as they are, have definitely opened the door for more representations. Not because I don't want to characterize them as positive or negative, just different and more, right? So it's not that these bad ones led to good ones, but that these led to these, led to these, led to these, right? And so that we have more than just one or two or three or four, but we have a plethora of representations to choose from.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sorry, like all of these questions are so amazing, and it's hard to like parse them out because they're coming in so quickly. But I wanna echo one point that you made, as sort of like these films at the time, right, which were very low budget, right, very like produced like very quickly, right, but we're often like the only vehicle that women like Pam Grier had, right, to showcase their talent. Right? And we've been doing a lot of screenings of these movies, right? And like a lot of them do not hold up, but one thing that does, right, is Pam Grier, right? As the
Yes,
right? She put her whole foot in that performance, you know,
yes.
like so where do we sort of like draw the line between like well, and I guess yeah, that's sort of like how like with like limited options, right? Like, and how do we honor like an individual's like agency, right? With also the tensions of like the quote unquote responsibility of like the audience that you're putting it for in front of, right? And maybe these were less like concerns like at the height of the Blaxploitation era, but are definitely things that more like marginalized folks are thinking about like now.
Yeah, that, you know, there's always a tension there. I think about that with some of the work that I do. It's just like I don't want to reinforce a stereotype, right? But then it's like, but what if this stereotype is my truth? So what do you do with that? And what is your responsibility? And I think that our responsibility is, you know, to tell the truth and to represent the truth. And so I think, but I don't think that it is our responsibility to carry or represent the culture, right? So individual Black folk are not responsible for all Black folk. We're just not, right? So we might have particular allegiances, and we know that the things that we do will have some kind of reflection, but we can't put the weight of that responsibility, because when you think about it, that does not happen to non-marginalized folk. White people do not think, well, do I want to make this decision because of how it will make other white people look? You know, I wish they would sometimes think about that, you know. But, you know, so it's like, I don't think that it's fair for us to, you know, to be self-sacrificial in that way. I think we can be very intentional. And I think that when you get to a particular point, even with the example of Viola Davis, right, that I was sharing, Viola Davis would not take that role now, right? And in retrospect, she talks about how she regrets having taken it in retrospect. But at the time, she was defending it. At the time, when people were coming at her after The Help came out, she was defending it because she's an actor, right? And in retrospect, I think she was like, this was not. But here's the truth of the matter. If she wouldn't have played it, they would have found another Black woman to play it, because, you know, because Black women have to work. We can't guilt trip Black women out of doing their jobs or making money, you know, because of how it makes us feel. So I think that if anything, we just need to leverage the space and the opportunities that we have to create better and more representations when we can, right? So because you can't, and I'm not saying that there are roles that you wouldn't want to take. Everybody would have to make that decision. There might be, you know, like you have your compass, right, into what you would and would not do, or what you would and would not feel comfortable doing. But I don't think that comfort level has to always be an allegiance to, you know, Black people writ large at the expense of yourself, right? Because what does that look like in reverse? You know, how does the universe of Black people, what is the universe of Black people sacrificing for me, right? So it's like we have to just figure out, how do we empower and affirm and each other, and then and make the sacrifices we have to make when we have to make them, and then make better decisions, or, you know, create better opportunities when we can.
Right. Yeah. And it sort of goes back to like sort of like your earlier point, right? Like the more multiplicity of representations and authorship that we have, right? The more that we get to like these more nuanced like understandings in these sort of like intersectional moments, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah, because, and the other, relatedly, you know, when I was doing some research for this and looking at some clips, there was, it was like a tribute to Pam Grier and her work. And so you saw some of the earlier but, you know, because a lot of, even before the Blaxploitation, she was doing some, you know, she was out here, right? And after the Blaxploitation, because of her popularity, then the types of roles she was able to get, she was able to get better roles. She was able to get roles that were not entirely about her body or her sexuality, right? And she was able to get roles over time, right? Off the strength of her recognizability, right? So when we think about some of the revamping of some of the Blaxploitation films, like Shaft and Jackie Brown, that brought her back and gave her it again so she can work, right? Because she's an actor, and actors act to eat, right? So, and so those are opportunities that she's still probably eating off of the Blaxploitation film she made, not because they're paying her, but because of the recognizability that it afforded her with future projects. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Question from the audience. Do you see changes or more opportunities for Black women in film today that aligns with different kinds of representations, like how we currently see in music? Or do you think this is really something that's happening in music but hasn't really made its way to film yet?
Oh no, I definitely think it's making it to film. And the reason is because we have more Black women, who are showrunners and directors and filmmakers. And that makes a difference, So I think about Ava DuVernay and Lena Waithe, our very own Rachel Ramis with the Crunk Feminist Collective, and one of Rachel's proteges, Sierra Glad. They are out here, helping to create these nuanced characters, right? So because it happens with people who are doing the writing, people who are doing the directing, right? Because how can you think how a woman director could take a character that's problematically flat, one-dimensional, but a director, right, can give it some can put some meat on the bones of it and give that character some weight, right? Some relevance, some reality, and so that they're not just a caricature. A director can do that, right? So it's like, who is writing the stuff, who's directing the stuff, who's producing the stuff, who's creating platforms. We have Issa Rae, and so there's so many Black women. This is like a Black women moment. It's a very powerful moment, and that's making those things possible. I hope it's a forever moment. I hope it continues forever, but it may or may not. But we're definitely seeing what happens when Black women are given those roles and opportunities. We get more fleshed out characterizations of Black women. So it's not that it was never possible. It was that Black women weren't in the writers' rooms, and Black women weren't given the weren't allowed, right, to do the thing with the character that they wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I definitely think that it's a moment, and it's a moment.
Yeah, and I hope it's right.
Me too.
So we've talked a lot about like film as well as like music, but one real medium that we haven't really addressed that does keep coming up in a couple of different questions is TV. And then specifically, like, what role do you think like the role of reality TV plays in advancing or narrowing the narrative of Black women? Do these shows also become another form of exploitation that needs to be overcome? I think this is a great question.
That is a great question. And, my theorization of ratchet respectability was born from the Real Housewives of Atlanta. So absolutely. Right? And reality television has become so pronounced that we oftentimes, because it's unscripted, we assume they're not acting, right? Or that they're just that badly behaved. And I do think that there's a very similar thing happening with reality television. And so I don't know who is in the audience and who can think back with me to Flavor of Love, right? Which was really the first primarily Black casted reality show. And it was like a spoof of The Bachelor, because The Bachelor was always white. And this is before anybody gave a damn that The Bachelor was always white, right? This is recent developments over the last couple of years due to controversies, but back then it was just like, yeah, so VH1 can have a whole show kind of playing off of that. And the thing that makes me sad about that is the way in which, you know, it became a reinforcement of these same stereotypes that we saw in real time. And when I feel like there was something genuine in, or there is something genuine in some of these reality shows as it relates to Black women wanting and deserving loving relationships. And the representations fail to offer us that. And we don't even have the buffer of saying it's fiction, or it's, you know, and we know it's somewhat fictional, but you know, it's not a movie. This is someone's life. And so so there was definitely a way in which some of these tropes were exaggerated, I feel. Anytime you have, it never happens, it never happens in the same ways with white casted shows, but in a Black show, you can see which trope these Black women are falling into, and they perform it, right? And that's kind of where the ratchet respectability came in, because we believe that this performance of race is a performance of low classness. What does it mean to be authentically Black, which still means you're poor, but also simultaneously a rich bitch like Nene on The Real Housewives? You know, so you're respectable because you're rich, but you're ratchet because you're Black. And you know, so how do you negotiate those two things? And so watching the performance of those things can be, you know, it's like a train wreck. You can't not watch. But yeah, I think it's the exact same problems, and you know, you'll see that those women get the same criticisms that we were talking about, that Pam Grier and the other women would get, who were actors, right? Because, you know, reality television stars, they're on TV because they're famous, right? Like, you know, they're like, what, D-list celebrities, so they're not, it's not the same thing. That's not, they have other jobs, right? So it's a little bit different. It's a different argument than, you know, I wouldn't be able to make the same argument for them that I can make for Pam Grier, in that she didn't have a choice. I think that in many ways these women knowingly and willingly play these roles so that they can get the airtime. And unfortunately, that's what's going to get them the airtime, you know, playing the script, the stereotype, the Black woman stereotype.
Yeah. I think reality TV in particular is like complicates these conversations because it has the artifice of reality, right? Without acting, but everything in reality TV is heavily mediated.
Edited. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So it throws another like complex layer onto these like questions of agency and authorship.
And what they know, knowing that they're going to be edited in a particular way, but knowing what, you know, you don't have a script, but you know your script. I think it's kind of what you know, so it's like, it's unscripted, but you know this stereotype, play this. This is, you're playing the angry Black woman, play that. And you don't even need a script because you know how to do that, right? Or you're the gold digger, play that. And we see, you know, and we see them very seamlessly, you know, fall into those roles and tropes.
Yeah.
Very easily. Mm-hmm.
I want to ask this next question because I think it's been touched on by a few different folks, but the way that this is written out is like very, I think is really good. Do you think that the abundance of hypersexual representations of Black women can influence and make Black women feel as though they have to be sexual? For example, there are a lot of like Black female singers and rappers that are very sexual, for example, Chloe Bailey. However, with other races of women, that seems to be more of a balance between sexual versus non-sexual. And would you say that that could be due to Black women feeling as though they only have that one asset to use?
That's a great question. Oh, wow. Because part of me thinks that there is definitely a way in which it's almost like an authentic black womanness that's attached to the being the siren, right? To being and to being that confident, right? It's almost like, am I failing at Black womanhood if I'm not, you know, if I don't have this confidence, or if I don't have this attitude, or if I, you know, because I think that these representations very clearly are not representative of asexuality, right? It's almost like a resistance or an intentional opposition to it. And I think because of that, it definitely makes it seem like this is what it is. And that being sexual or being hypersexual in a particular way is a signal of being grown, which is interesting to me for Black women, because like I was saying, Black girls are adultified, and you know, even when they're girls, they're already being hypersexualized in a way that I think white girls are often shielded and protected in some ways, right? Everybody's kind of vulnerable. All femmes and girls are vulnerable in particular ways. But when I'm thinking about music in particular, and I'm not you know, totally tuned in, but when I think about someone like, you know, like your Chloe Bailey, or and your Ari Lennox, you know, like I'm thinking about recent songs that I'm really into that are very sexualized, right? And I'm thinking about that from the lens of my grown woman self. But what would that have meant, you know, 30 years ago? And what did it mean? What did it mean when I was 15, 16 and listening to Little Kim and not really knowing what being a queen bitch was, but knowing I wanted to be that, right? Not really knowing, understanding what it would mean to swallow a Sprite can, but wanting to do that, you know what? Feeling like I should know how to do that, right? So I think that there is definitely a pressure to it, right? So I think that it's fair to acknowledge that, right? And to critique that in trying to resist one thing and promote this thing, you're still ignoring or not representing this thing, or you're overrepresenting this and not representing that. What would it mean to be a romantic Black woman? Where's your representation, right? I don't think that that these representations are necessarily absent queer representation, but they're definitely absent gender nonconforming, right? You know, so when we say Black woman, what does that mean, right? So yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think that there is a way in which, you know, the inherent embedded hypersexualization of Black women and Black girls bleeds into all of that, right? And so I think that there probably is, because I know that Chloe Bailey has, in some interviews, has talked about just trying to prove that she's grown. So it's almost like, and you know, and that's interesting, right? Because then then being sexy or having sex becomes the signal to adulthood, which that ain't it, right? Like that's not, you know, but so yeah, that's interesting. I have thoughts, but I don't have an answer. But I have thoughts. So yeah, that's good. I don't know. That's very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And I especially think like, right, like one of the things that I think like as a salient point from like your lecture tonight has been, right, like the answer to a lot of these questions or like problems, right, is a multiplicity of representations, right?
Right.
And I think
Absolutely.
like we're experiencing like the opposite pendulum swing, and unfortunately that still does leave out a lot from like our current.
Right. It creates the false binary of you're either this or this, and it leaves out everything in between. And there's so much in between.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So dipping back a little into our reality TV question, but also just like an overarching theme is sort of what is we talk about like how we can't really blame, you know, Pam Grier for accepting these roles or like taking these roles and stuff. What is our responsibility as like consumers of culture, right? Like where do we to draw the line? And this question was sort of like framed like I'm just assuming lots of things, but I'm assuming it's specifically about reality reality TV and then like Black folks and Black women who watch reality TV?
That's a great question, right? I feel like I have an answer to that because the Ratchet Respectability chapter I wrote engages this. So bell hooks suggests that says that Black women need to be critical consumers of culture, critical consumers of culture. Black women in particular. Why? Because culture is telling you this about yourself. What do you know about yourself, right? So it's like, don't just accept what you see as truth or the truth or your truth. Be a critical consumer. So challenge it. Don't question it. Compare it to your experiences. Is that a representation as you know it of Black womanhood? And also other responsibility of Black women. So Black women have to be critical consumers. So we can't, because I don't necessarily think that what we need to do is, to say, well, we should just stop watching it, because damn it can be enjoyable. It's entertainment, right? Every time I try to leave it alone, they catch me on a marathon and I'm back, I'm all in again, right? It's entertainment. And I think that if you're a critical consumer, you can make those, you can engage something that's problematic and understand what's problematic about it, right? So for me, being a critical consumer means I can watch it and then I can talk about what's wrong, right? That's what being a critic is. It's like engaging it. Doesn't mean you engage it. It doesn't, and you don't have to hate everything, right? Because critiquing something inevitably means you're gonna kind of think about and think through and deconstruct what's wrong, but it doesn't mean you can't enjoy it. It doesn't mean it's not an enjoyable thing, right? Reality television can be interesting. My mom is all into 90 Day Fiance, and I was like, nope, don't even tell me. I don't want to know because I'm not getting into another show. But but it's like, it's just an escape. It's like any other television. It becomes an escape, and we become invested in these characters. The other thing that bell hooks offers us is this having an oppositional gaze, right? And that means that essentially you are again not just accepting what you see, but challenging it and opposing it, and kind of having a relationship with the things that you consume that is kind of interactional, right? And so you can take what you can get from it and you can throw the rest of it away, right? You don't have to accept those representations. So I think being a critical consumer, having the conversations, right? Because like if my family wants to watch Tyler Perry movie, and damn it, we gonna talk about what's wrong with it after. If you make me watch it, we gonna have to talk about everything that's wrong, right? Like all the problematic things. And I think that's a fair way. That I don't think it's real. I don't even think it's realistic to say, well, we just need to all stop watching it, because something maybe someone's, that's the thing, that's how they unwind or whatever. And I think that's okay. I just think we have to be critical consumers, and we have to always have an oppositional gaze to representations of us, right? Especially if they're representations that were not for us, by us. I think there is a reason that people feel so resonant to these, like Issa, like Insecure. People are so sad it's going to be over, because those were resonant characters. It was like based on real life. Imagine that, like real life people. It could be a real life person and not just a character, because so many times Black women and Black people are characters. They are like sidekicks. They're comedic relief. They're, you know what I'm saying? But they're not well-rounded characters. So, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and like you were saying earlier, right? Like it feels like we're in a very special moment. I don't even know if like 5 years ago we could have had like a program like this, and I'm so glad we could.
Yeah.
But I really love this concept of like, what did you called it, relational critique, or, but not being like a passive consumer, right? Of
Right.
developing a strong analysis of it. I just want to put on like a last call for any questions that anyone may have before we close it out. I am seeing one in here that I can actually answer. Were Blaxploitation films recognized as exploitative when they first came out? So this is late 60s, early 70s. And yes, they were. The term Blaxploitation was actually coined by the president of the NAACP. So right from like the jump, Blaxploitation films were controversial, both like on a larger cultural conversation, but also in an inter-community like conversation. They've always been this tension between representation and public consumption of that representation. Oh, another question that came up is where can folks follow your work? How can they keep up with you and get a hold of you?
Awesome. So I am a crunk feminist. So I don't have an Instagram because I'm old, right? But we have one. The group has one. I just don't have a personal one. So at Crunk Feminist. And you can also check out my website that contains a lot of the work that I do and links to things. That's robinboylorn.com.
That's great.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah. Robin, before I close this out, do you have any like closing words that you wanted to share, or like last, like I know you broke us down with like that beautiful conclusion, but then we got into all these juicy questions.
Yeah, no, it's great. One of the things, like I was saying, this was so much fun and so interesting because, I'm really like this is what I think about Blaxploitation. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to kind of rethink that, and I'm glad that the exhibit is trying to change the conversation about Blaxploitation film and kind of think about what do we get from it versus what does it take from us, right? And so I was just thinking about how, we could have a similar conversation about representations of Black men, right? And cool masculinity and all of that. So I just wanted to encourage everyone that's in the area to check out the exhibit. And if you can't do it in person, definitely online. And I just also encourage people to go back and look at some of these films, right? They're so terrible, they're good, right? And but you'll see, you can't watch one of these films and not see what we were talking about, like literally within the first few minutes, you'll see this hypersexualization. And when you think about it in the context of who was writing it for who, it gives you a completely different perspective of it. So I appreciate the opportunity to think about something I think about a lot differently. So thank you.
Robin, thank you so much for this engaging presentation and for all of like the fun and hard work you've put into it. And thank you all for attending tonight. Feminist as Fuck is available wherever books are sold. And You Won't Bleed Me, How Blaxploitation Defined Cool and Delivered Profits is on view at Poster House through February 6th. Thank you all so much and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone, bye.